A common thread I see is that the Ka-50 Black Shark was a tech demonstrator working up to the Ka-52, and that the single-seat attack helicopter was unworkable on too much stress. Well, tests from military scientists in the extensive head-to-head trials disagree with that opinion. But for that we need context, and we need history. Note that while this might have taken me a long time to collate and summarize and get into right order, it's a massively abbreviated history, where I'm not painting in all the whys or relevant details in this chain of events. 1966 Kamov and MIL design bureaus competed for the first big Soviet attack helicopter. Now, while the Kamov's Ka-25F mock-up might have looked like a Coaxial UE, or maybe just a small respec of the Ka-25, it was spec'd for a 23mm turret, 96 rockets, 80 GMs, and or up to 8 troops. It was dropped at the mock-up stage for not advancing tech enough, and MIL's V-24 was selected as more promising and developed into the Mi-28 Hind, mass-produced later in many variants. Soon after 66, both MIL and Kamov had various concepts of futuristic helicopters and compound rotorcraft, though none of these gained traction to be more than just ideas. The Hind was intended to have the new anti-tank Sturms from the start, but by the time they were ready and going into production in the Mi-24V from 1976 onwards, Soviet command already wanted something better in the pipeline, keenly aware of NATO's tests with helicopters' anti-tank performance. It didn't need a transport cabin, needed to be all-weather and around-the-clock capable, more protection for the cockpit, fuel, tanks, and vital components, up to maybe 12.7mm. And it should exceed foreign helos, notably the upcoming American H-64A Apache. Price, ease of maintenance using normal equipment, crew survivability, and powerful and precise long-range 80 GMs capable of firing from nap of the earth were also preferred or required. So the Soviet ministry issued a decree in December 1976 for the Hind successor and replacement, opening the competition between MIL's Mi-28 Havoc and Kamov's V-80, later named the Ka-50 Black Shark. With the new requirements, MIL worked off a new design with a traditional helo layout, advancing some features they'd been testing on the Hind and the Hip, and taking some notes from the H-64. Kamov interpreted the next-gen helo as being good nap of the earth, slayed NO tanks in bulk from stand-off range outside of Roland and Manpad range. So maybe a fuller-gap Abrams and Leopard Slayer, facing many short-range SAMs and shrugging off light to medium caliber return fire. They went with a coaxial design they're so famous for, but looking at the lofty performance goals, a problem was the Soviet electronics were really heavy. Since Kamov had a lot of expertise with target automation and data links from their submarine hunting choppers, they made the radical step of cutting out 1.5 tons of dry weight by making it single seat. And while there's little less costs with training, supporting, and possibly losing a second pilot, on helicopters where 100 kilos already makes a massive difference in design, cutting that 1.5 tons was the primary reason. And they had to fight for that. They had to justify how that was feasible, given the tech. Just after the competition was announced, MIL, the dominant land supplier at the time, called up and confirmed that if the competition announcement was a mistake, why they're not just simply awarded the Mi-28. That was rejected and the competition proceeded. Mock-ups and factory tests on the prototypes in various conditions of flight and weapons deployment were reviewed in the early development. With the Cold War getting a bit hotter, the successor was meant to roll out as the frontline unit ASAP in vast numbers, maybe even 1987. So it was deemed that the review of the factory tests with the oversight of the official institutes would be enough to make the decision. Then the Mi-28 received an award for serial production from the ministries, before the competition results were in or the Mi-28 even met the minimum spec. Then the Shark won the official review from aviation and all the institutes set up to run the competition end of 1984, set to enter state trials and serial production under the designation Ka-50. Without funds for its serial production award, the Mi-28 then didn't actually enter production, but neither did the Shark. Without revoking the decisions from the selection of the Ka-50 winning, the competition was reopened and extended into comparative testing. Then the Shark was listed better in total, again from the results in 86, and late 87 declared the winner, again. By official Soviet decree in 87, the V-80SH-1, now called the Ka-50, was awarded the new Soviet frontline attack helicopter and to have serial production, while the take of the Havoc was to be retained by developing the Mi-28A further into an export-only product. Further, some of the Mi-28 advances were to be rolled back to the Mi-24s, which makes sense also given the vast fleet they had and all the export orders. This award fully intended not to complement but to replace the Mi-24 with Ka-50s in the Soviet forces, with export customers getting Mi-28As and upgraded Mi-24s. This was confirmed by the plants assigned to manufacture, with the Ka-50 being produced at Arseniev that made almost 2,500 Mi-24s for the Soviet frontline forces, while Rostov-on-Don, earmarked for the Mi-28 exports, historically did export Heinz. Up till 88, the same number of flying prototypes of V-80s and Mi-28 variants had been built. After that, the Sharks were built in greater numbers until the late 2000s. The Ka-50 gets handed to the testing centers, gets the initial production run of 12 to 13 units, and pilots are trained on it. About 91, the ejection seat passes the state testing, and the final production model is set and serial production ongoing slowly. In 93, the Ka-50 got to be the title star in the movie Chornoya Akula, or Black Shark, but only after Mill passed up having the Mi-28 be the star, insinuating the movie's budget is better spent on the generals deciding the helicopter competition than making the movie. The popularity of the movie gave the Shark its new name. Throughout the competition, some of the higher-ups standing by the competition evaluations and scorings favoring the Ka-50 passed on or moved on. The new balance of power favored a two-seater, read the Mi-28, despite not being in the requirements. A new Ka-52 two-seater variant gets touted as a sweetener, hoping it would be the scout lead and to an extent a trainer for the Ka-50s, thereby reviving the Shark production line, which got stalled out of funds. The mock-up and promise of the two-seater Ka-52 worked, and the Ka-50 entered service in 95. But with the economic collapse and more politics, its development funding and production run dry up, and many airframes sit half-built for a decade. On the Mi-28 front, it got interesting. After results of the competition in 86, it released the Mi-28A, but that then didn't go into production to export like the decree of 87 specified, but instead continued in some form of comparative combat testing and chose to continue development into the Mi-28N Night Hunter. Some are intended to still compete with the Ka-50 for deployment in Russian forces, instead of just export. The Night Hunter prototype, with incomplete mission equipment, first flies almost a decade later. Compared to the Mi-28 the Shark was in competition with, it revised the gearbox and transmission for the third or fourth time, expanded its G limits, though still well short of the Ka-50, gets the X-tail, revises the engines from 117V to 117 VMAs, switches to digital avionics, upgrades the sights from what was similar to the Mi-24 to flare. The second Mi-28N with full equipment only flies in 2003. For reference, in the same time period, from what I could tell, the Shark got lightweight digital avionics, some day-link upgrades, the ejection seat and GPS map, and new generation night vision goggles. Despite being easy about using pylon-mounted flare pods or thermals instead of being mounted in the fuselage, many Soviet optic companies got hacked up with the collapse of the Union, so FLIR only got integrated into Russian helos from about 97. First on the Mi-28N testbed, and then on select Ka-50s. In time, Mi-28Ns, Ka-52s, Mi-24 and Mi-35s, and even some Mi-8s are given a FLIR. But the frontline, in-service Ka-50, required to be night capable of the original tender, isn't given FLIR as the production standard, even though some of these pods are made by the same companies that are supplying the later helicopters. The Ka-50 performs well in combat in 2001, but by then interest has somehow shifted to the Ka-52 and Mi-28 under development. Meanwhile, the Mi-24, meant to be replaced, gets substantial revisions developed and produced, not all export or upgrade packages. The Ka-50 tests the President S system, and the last two units are finished from the production line. The Mi-28N and Ka-52 both enter serial production 2009 and 2011 respectively, and since then keep jostling for which is produced more. The final flight of the Ka-50 was on 8 November 2012, after which the remaining Sharks entered deep storage. You notice anything missing from that super-condensed history? Maybe the bit where the Shark shows limitations in combat or unable to mount new mission equipment, too expensive or ancient, leading to the new tender for the replacement of the Shark as the official frontline unit? No? Because it never happened. So it ended, but why? Did it fail from being coaxial? No, there's certain performance advantages to a coax, especially lower speeds and gusting crosswinds. It's not better in every condition, but there's possibly some advantages also regarding vibrations, as well as climb rate that has significant gains. The Ka-52s are still using the exact same rotor system, and the maintenance stats makes it seem like they take the normal kind of man-hours for the other Soviet or Russian attack helicopters. And once you deal with the automation mechanics, and when you have an ample power to weight, like the Shark does, even before all the automation, you have something that needs less pilot focus to keep in the air flying like you want it to, which is part of the reason why they felt confident that they could make it single seat. There were two accidents in its history where the rotors collided. Both occurred during aerobatics, where the pilots tried to push the frontiers into unmodeled flight regimes, which other helos couldn't attempt either. This is flight regimes on a heli already approved for doing full loops and other extremes, sometimes heavily loaded. And you can see in some next-gen helos like Raider and Defiant, combining coax with push props to do some really cool stuff. Okay, so did it then fail because it was the single seat concept? I don't think so. Or rather, I don't think it failed because the single seat wasn't performing as much as it was an alien concept to the brass and potential export customers. And eventually the role grew bigger. And possibly just because it wasn't the specific contender. Tests by multiple institutes during the very competitive evaluation, down on the physical and mental stresses during combat and flight, measured the Ka-50 pilot at the same levels as the Mi-28 crew. This was due to the extensive automation and coax ease of use. And just like some fighter pilots prefer flying single seat if the jet is capable of letting them handle the radar and other sensors and systems without a second seater, it seems most Black Shark pilots, which were often two-seat Mi-24 veterans, had favorable testimonies of the Shark. When it went into combat, it wasn't sent in as a shining new fleet in force, but only enough budget for the workup and prep of 2 Sharks and limiting ATGM use, and it almost wasn't sent there at all. There were no longer integrated air defenses, but the threat of AAA and manpads remained. It attacked prescribed targets, but also found and destroyed high-value targets in free roam hunting and patrolling, including just the Sharks themselves without other escorts or scout ships. Many missions were in gusty, narrow mountain gorges, and 2/3 of the missions were in bad weather, fog, or at night. I can't tell you the specifics of if that was with night vision goggles only, but I have read that during a separate display in a dark night, the Ka-50 found and tracked 2 tanks in the automatic modes to launch Vickers on it. So while rated day only, the production Ka-50 with the Schwalbe was somewhat capable in the dark. One of the Ka-50s received battle damage early on and awaited new blades, so most of the missions were only 1 Ka-50 with a Heinz and Ka-29 in the experimental combat group. And while one might think that they were sent on the safer cherry-picked missions, Ka-50s alone destroyed 70% of the targets discovered by aviation in that time, and with the tape reviews, all targets it was sent to engage were successfully destroyed, despite the Ka-50s only being less than 10% of the attack helicopter force there at that time. The pilots noted it was easy to navigate, the power margins and the coaxial configuration, and how much the system offloaded their piloting. The entire group received awards after the combat tour. Most sources indicate the Shark was cheaper to make and maintain than the Mi-28. It might have been slightly more expensive than the Mi-24 at the time, though apparently its production was easier than the Mi-24 once the factory converted to the heavy use of composites. It didn't require special basing or equipment to maintain, and the technicians could come from a Mi-24 background and maintain it without any extensive special training. For protection, it's anecdotally implied that it had heavier protection than the Mi-28, which is itself already much more extensive over the tanky Mi-24, with staff even showing off 20 mils hitting the cockpit while sitting inside. Possibly even the most armored attack helicopter ever. Along with its Ka-52 successor, the Ka-50 is the only produced attack helicopter with an ejection seat. Speeds and flight ranges were comparable between the Ka-50 and Mi-28 in terms of maneuvers, ignoring the marketing noise of unique to funnel or first to loop that all the manufacturers say. Both the Mi-28 and Ka-50 can do those maneuvers. However, if you go looking at aerobatics, you'll see the Shark could do stuff with speed and aggression the Mi-28 and Mi-24 just can't. And its G limits were much wider. Despite its agility, some generals criticized it for being too well armored, implying it was too sluggish. So, can't win, I guess. In terms of gunnery, its accuracy was superior to the Mi-28 in testing, at least once both their targeting packages matured. In exhibitions, it outperformed the upgraded Mi-24 PNs. These were the Heinz upgraded with laser ranging and had a greater ceiling than most previous Heinz. Keep in mind the Mi-28s during the competition had missiles apparently sub 6 kilometers, whereas the Vickers were 8+. And the Mi-28 scope was only 13 times zoom compared to the Shark's 23 times. Though those metrics shouldn't affect the accuracy of the unguided weapons, which the Shark also excelled at. Make no mistake, I'm not saying the Ka-50 beat out the Mi-28 because control by the single seat was more efficient. But having saved all that weight, it had better performance in the other categories. And while it took the Mi-28s a while to iron out some issues, When it finally met and exceeded the minimum specs, the Shark succeeded it more. As for the limited production run, the numbers I've seen often state 5 pre-production or prototype Sharks were built, and then 12 were made in production. The vast majority built by 2000 and another 2-ish in 2009, so probably 17 in total. Now if the small production run makes you think it's just a prototype, let me contrast it with Concorde's, which appears to have 4 built in pre-production and 16 produced, total 20. Very real, just limited numbers and limited lifespan ultimately, despite best intentions. As for the variances between the individual Sharks, development of any combat helo is going to have a lot of individual tests or upgrades, all wanting to make their way to the main production units. The smaller your end production line is, the more time passes in the evaluation, the higher percentage of these is going to be units that have had some kind of modification or isolated upgrade done on them. And partly to revive funding in mass production, Kamov were very quick to test new equipment. At least 2 Sharks were remodeled into the Ka-52 mockup and Ka-50-2 Erdogan mockup, since they have 85% same airframe and commonality including the rotors. A few Ka-50s were reworked into Ka-52s. It's mainly the nose and internal avionics that differ. And excluding the 17 Ka-50s, at least 4 Ka-50 airframes sitting unfinished in the factory floor were then completed into Ka-52s. In conclusion, you have the Ka-50 stepping up from naval anti-submarine warfare legacy and automated systems into the attack helicopter boxing ring. There's an urgent need for a champion, and someone needs to wear that belt ASAP. It defeats the competition, but doesn't get the title. Numerous rematches were held, and like a dramatized wrestling scene, the fight spills over outside the ring. The Shark gets speeding up in a round every now and then, but ultimately it wins the fights. Finally it gets awarded the title, but the victory is hollow, and the belt, prize money, magazine cover, and fancy protein shakes to stay in shape are shared pretty much equally with everyone else, even those not in the fights. Over the years, it dances around and outpunches other opponents that weren't even supposed to be in that league in the exhibition matches. Then new contenders, its own Ka-52 protege, and Mi-28N, son of its former rival, enter the ring. But the reigning Ka-50 champion, still young and spry and capable, doesn't get a chance to defend its title. Instead, the title is given to the new contenders to battle for, and it's quietly implied the reigning champion should retire. That's in a nutshell the chain of declarations and awards without the context between. And no, the Ka-50 wasn't super functional out the box in the early 80s, nor did it win every individual test and category of the competition. And no, I don't quite hold up to the argument of them just trying to retain jobs throughout the entire sector. The Rostov plant was also fighting for the incomplete Mi-28 in Russian forces, even though they historically did all the export, and Arseniev assigned the production to the Russian forces. This at a time Arseniev was hanging on by a thread with multiple short-funded incomplete Shark frames gathering dust. Shubinov, who made the 2A42 cannon and the Vichar ATGMs, paid their staff at one point 6 months in arrears, even stopped producing Vichars at one point. In 2005, the Shark was receiving no funding, and the Ka-50 to an amount that would shut down Kamov, as similarly the massive Arseniev plant wasn't in a good place. This is at a time when the second Mi-28N just started flying, but wasn't nearly there in any kind of state trials. And some revised Hind variants just started appearing. It's only with extensive lobbying from Kamov and Arseniev to select senior personnel and the media that they got the Ka-52 into special forces as a role, and resumption of the Ka-50 serial production, which basically just meant completing the airframes that had already been standing there for a decade. Also no, I don't think it was a lack of training variants that hurt the Shark, as the first Mi-28, with piloting controls for the front seater as well, only flew in 2013. Also, a Shark 2-seat tandem trainer wasn't planning in 1985, but scrapped due to time constraints, and the funding was snipped in case the Mi-28 won the extended evaluation. Now note the competition didn't have fancy helmet displays like the iHads or top-hull helmets to aid the Mi-28 crew with coordination, nor could it help the single-seat Ka-50 with flight data and scopes while the single pilot was looking to the side or going heads down. And as far as for the sources saying Kamov was the popular kid and had all the favors done, no. Kamov's head designer and the location of the offices were way lesser in status than those afforded to Mil when the competition started. Any popularity they gained would have been from pushing to meet the requirements with the Ka-50. There's a bunch of other supposed less savory efforts from the competition, high-ranging generals and ministers at multiple events, as well as Western interference, supposedly, at exhibitions, and every time it was making strides at export sales. That said, military procurement sometimes maybe is lively, so I can't say how much of that and the other events I listed is par for the course in big procurement, or if this was an exceptional case. Either way, if you go digging, you'll find quite a few examples where the most economic and best fit for purpose product is bypassed for something else, or where something's procured out of the blue with no competition evaluation and a suspiciously rushed one. Would it have been better had Kamov went with the Ka-52 from the start? I don't know. That wouldn't have had the radar, it would have been carrying that weight with lesser engines and the heavier analog avionics, probably reducing its flight performance. And it's not like the competition, the exclusions and political interference and lobbying stopped once the two-seater was available. So maybe it was less the fact that it was a single-seater and more the fact that it was Kamov. Now, would the Ka-50 actually stand a shot in the ring versus the modern helos today? It's still dangerous, and entering a modern battlefield with adequate maintenance, intel, logistics, and other support, it would be a serious threat. Would it be as good? Hells no. Outside most of the tech being 3 decades old, I'd wager the extended roles, electronic warfare elements, and maybe more fluid battle tactics might be too much for one pilot. At least if it operated in homogeneous formations of only single-seaters rather than having command elements as part of the formation. I don't know if in modern day one would still save 1.5 tons of dry weight as per the original 1977 design of a super heavy armored attack helo, but I'm imagining that you might have better weight savings from smaller chipsets automating the helicopter, whereas you might not have as much weight reduction since for control links, armor, and weight of the second seater, should such a concept ever resurface. Now the Shark was specifically designed to kill masses of tanks efficiently, nap at the earth, out of reach of shorter range SAMs, and under threat of low caliber return fire. That role might not be as important as it was during the Cold War scenarios. So, that's a super simplified history which took way too much time to distill, likely fact from fiction, and combine the disparate sources, but is hopefully close to the actual events. As you might tell, there's a lot of details, interesting design decisions, compromises, political and marketing ploys from both parties I've glossed over. Hopefully sometime in the distant future I'll flesh that out properly, and the additional context of these events might make them more understandable. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed this little summary of what wasn't meant to be. This is Volk. Cheers.